We're just a couple weeks away from the European International Championships, so everyone had their eyes on the Mérida Regional Championships happening in Mexico over the weekend. It was the first opportunity for players to utilise the new Prismatic Evolutions cards, most notably the Regigigas and Budew inclusions. We've seen the online results, we've seen the Japanese data. It looked like Dragapult Dusknoir was poised to be a fantastic pick, as well as Lugia and Gardevoir, with the narrative mostly circling around the fact that we are narrowing in the metagame, with these three being far better than the other choices in the format, with some nod to the likes of Archaludon, Miraidon, and the Terrapagos Poison deck. Because Mérida was so easy to travel for many East Coast Americans, we saw lots of fantastic players making their way to Mérida, as well as a strong contingent of LATAM players. And to say that the results were surprising is a massive understatement. Let's get into it. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. Let's start off with the asymmetrical top cut then, and the massive story that stands out is that we have 5 Miraidon lists, as well as 5 Dragapult lists in this top 14, with only 1 Gardevoir, 0 Lugia, 0 Ceruledge, 0 Archaludon. As expected, Regidrago V-Star is no longer on that pedestal, but we also saw some big placements for Gouging Fire, a Quad Thorns list, as well as that Terrapagos Poison list, incorporating Budew. To be honest, going into this tournament, I was hyping up Miraidon a lot. It's an archetype that I've been testing a lot before the EUIC, and it was pretty obvious as to why. Many Gardevoir builds weren't teching in Klefki in favour of having other mirror tech cards and help against Dragapult Dusknoir, with the likes of Cresselia making it into their deck list, sometimes even TM Devolution, rather than having that Klefki protection. Whilst at the same time, Miraidon is pretty decent into the big 3 that we were anticipating. Clearly, Miraidon has a decent time into Lugia. It has fantastic type coverage and can use Iron Hands on the single prizes that Lugia tries to present, and comes out the gate swinging, and against the stage 2s, Miraidon simply puts them on a clock. If the opponent isn't able to get that TM Evolution developed, it's very quick for Miraidon to run away with games with that early aggressive Iron Hands. The domination of Miraidon so early in our format is quite interesting actually, because I think it might open the door for a couple other archetypes to have more of a say going into the EUIC. Archaludon, for example, looks to be a much better positioned archetype if it can feast on the Miraidon and Dragapult lists, whilst being still reasonable into Gardevoir with those jamming towers. The Clorf Terrapagos deck can also be a headache for the Miraidon players. They both have good racing potential, but Clorf is a very powerful single prize option that they can use, forcing the Miraidon players to get multiple Iron Hands throughout the game, as well as gusting opportunities. Whereas Clorf often needs much less, and has the option of Budew if they've had a slower start. I also think Ancient Box still has a decent placement that did really well in Osaka, don't forget, and with more basic aggressive attacking decks like Gouging Fire in addition to Miraidon, I think the door could be open for something like an Ancient Box style deck because of the lack of hand disruptors in the format with these aggressive builds, also having that great type coverage into Gardevoir, of course, and needing so little against the Dragapult players as well. So those are the main shifts that I'm going to be monitoring in the couple weeks leading up to the EUIC. But let's look at the deck lists that were most successful, why they did so well this weekend, and how I think they might have to adapt before the EUIC. And well, would you look at that, Azul GG coming out on top, now becoming the most regional winning player in the world, with 8 regional victories under his belt, and passing Michael Pramwort. The hilarious thing about this is he's been taking a break this season. I think this is only the second major he's been to all season, and he's come away with a victory. Most of the time you'll find him on Twitch during the official streams and taking viewership away from them, which is a bit annoying. But this really does go to show just how fantastic of an in-game player Azul is. He played Miraidon for a couple days before the tournament, rocks up with a pretty solid list, and by just having fantastic fundamentals and in-game play, was able to take the victory. There's nothing too surprising about the deck list overall. I think the standouts in terms of Pokemon which are worth discussing, actually the Magnemite being a 50 hit point Magnemite. This is the one with the best attack in the game, in that Magnetic Charge can be a panic option. It's essentially a Motivate from Squawkabilly, but you do 0 damage, but this is a 1 prize Pokemon. So if all else has failed and you haven't had that rip-roaring turn 1 going second, you can at least use the Magnemite and try and force a single prize KO to the opponent. And yeah, this 50 hit point Magnemite, it gets punished a little bit more by Dusclops specifically, but I've played a lot of the Dragapult Dusknoir matchup, and typically they're going to rely on a Dusknoir rather than a Dusclops and taking out the single prize KO. Normally they're looking to double into something like a Squawkabilly or a Mew or one of these lower hit point V or EX Pokemon on your bench by sprinkling with Dragapult and then getting into a Curse Blast from Dusknoir. The other notable inclusion is the Rotom V. This either indicates that Azul was happy to go first in a number of situations, or simply acknowledged that a lot of decks want to go second and force the Miraidon player first. Ending your turn on that instant charge gives you extra card advantage, working towards a combination of Boss's Orders and Electric Generator for the second turn of the game. and can just give you discard fodder for Ultra Ball and Secret Box if you are able to establish a turn 1 Magneton, which is very powerful when you get to go first. It means that on your turn 2 attack, you're not so reliant on generators. In fact, you can just use an Overvolt Discharge guaranteeing those energy to establish that turn 2 Iron Hands, but of course your opponent's only had 1 turn to respond. In my playtesting, Rotom's been a strange card in that it's a great one to get established, but oftentimes it forces you to find the Area 0 Underdepths on the following turn to actually go wide with your other great bench ability Pokemon. So it's one that I'm going to continue to test. One notable card that wasn't included in the deck list was Zapdos from Pokemon Go. This might have just been a metagame call, where Azul wasn't expecting too much Archaludon, where I think this card really shines. It allows you to Iron Hands through a Duraludon to initiate that 2-prize KO, and of course at the same time it allows Miraidon to hit 230, which is a critical number into a number of EX Pokemon, and can also help out Raichu into a Gardevoir with 1 less energy. So there are a number of situations where the Zapdos comes up. Of course it's also a Mimikyu answer, and we'll come to that in a moment with some of the Gardevoir 60s. So I think Zapdos is probably a better play as we head towards the EUIC. So it's definitely an inclusion that I want to think about, and possibly that Rotom might have to come out of the list. I think the other slot that might be wiggle room right now is that 16th copy of Basic Lightning. Yes, it's good. Yes, it improves your ratios, but we have seen a number of successful Miraidon lists also cope with just the 15 basic and the 1 double turbo energy. So if we are trying to squeeze in that space, I think that's another one on my chopping block. Speaking of which, that's why I think Bravery Charm is still a core inclusion in the deck. This plus the Switch card does give you some counterplay to Gardevoir setting up some KOs, and Dragapult in the same instance trying to set themselves up for a Dusknoir swing. Overall, very streamlined, strong 60 from Azul. Zapdos is the main card that I'm considering going into the next few tournaments though. With Mauricio's 2nd place finish at Mérida, he is now the most accomplished Gouging Fire player in the world, with a number of strong placements, this of course being the highlight, with an extremely impressive 2nd place finish. Gouging Fire surprisingly gains a lot from Prismatic Evolutions. Charizard was previously one of the most difficult matchups for the Gouging Fire deck, and that's completely off the radar now. Plus, there's a debate among the player base around Manaphy in the Stage 2 archetypes, now that Regidrago V-Star is far less prevalent and there's less fear of Kyurem. That allows this Fire Toolbox deck to actually be one of the best aggressive sniping builds in the game, with that potential Magical Fire combination coming together pretty quickly with the help of Energy Switch from Asada, plus Magma Base and attach on that Delphox. It does sound like a big combination of course, but you have that Forest Seal Stone to grab Secret Box that gets a lot of things into your hand in one go. Additionally, Gouging Fire is a great beneficiary of Monkey Dory. This is a phenomenal card to deny a lot of the output from Dragapult players while setting them up for KOs, and can also punish Gardevoir players, which have to heavily damage a lot of their single prize Pokemon, especially when you're utilizing Bravery Charm on your own basic EXs to make them much more tanky options. You can see in the deck list there's already a lot of respect for Gardevoir because there's also a Lost Vacuum coming into the 60. And unlike Miraidon, this deck naturally plays around Sob, plays around Mawile, and plays around just generally control variants so much smoother because in addition to your 1 Switch card, you have those 4 Jet Energy and 4 Stadium to bounce any random Temple of Sinnohs that a Snorlax has, so you really have a field day into those matchups. Naturally, Gouging Fire is one of the more combo-centric aggressive style archetypes, so I imagine it will continue to not be a very popular pick, probably less than 5% going into the EUIC, but you have to respect its metagame placement being far improved from previous formats, and genuinely should be considered as a high-tier deck in this format that is simply underplayed right now. One interesting note that I want to experiment with is Lumineon V coming into the deck list, just to give me some additional outs to get into games. It may end up being slightly better than a Trekking Shoe in the list, but to be fair at the same time, Lumineon is always one of those Pokemon that you have to like begrudgingly put into play rather than want to, but there are also those situations where your hand is simply dead without those additional outs when you are going to be constantly hit with Iono. Another card to consider is Mew EX. I think this combination of Mew plus Pheasantipity gives you so much more draw to close out games. Your opponent will often be taking out your active Pokemon, because 3 energy on Gouging Fire basically can't be ignored, it's too dangerous to be kept around, and they're going to try and make you scramble for your next Basin plus Sada combination, so having both Mew and Fez on board gives you so much more protection. Leandro and Raphael played the same 60 in Mérida for the top 4 and top 8 placements respectively. Here you can see the priority for our players was a 60 hit point Magnemite option. Ironically, this isn't the best Magnemite you can be playing. I don't think you ever need that big explosion attack, so the 1 for 20 is actually the optimal Magnemite if you want to have a 60 hit pointer. Beyond that, there were very few differences between this one and Azul's list, where there's a second copy of Forest Hill Stone just so that you don't prize it, over one of those energy cards, but beyond that it's the same as Azul's 60, which means we're getting down to a real science with Miraidon at this stage. And then for the final Miraidon, which also made top 8, was Caleb Rogerson. Again, just a few differences here. It isn't playing Hisuian Heavy Ball, which I actually personally really hate. Look how many important one-ofs you play in the 60. I think Hisuian is mandatory. But this is one of the few 60s that actually does opt to play the Pokemon Go Zapdos, which does respect a number of matchups. There's a lot of reasons to like this one-off inclusion. Let's have a look at the Poison deck then from Rolando. This is the one Budgie in the deck list to have a new attacking option on turn 1. Of course, Terrapagos can't attack with Unified Beatdown on the first turn going second, so you have an aggressive attacking option from Clorf if you face multi-prizes, but now the Budgie, which gives you a way to knock out your opponent's basic evolving Pokemon, utilizing the Mochi plus Sneasler Bonnet combo. A few things to point out, there is still the Electrode V and the super effective Glasses in the deck list. Now, I'm personally of the opinion that I think your Charizard matchup is already okay without this combination these days, because you already have Budgie, which is so good in the opening stages against these evolving decks, that they're not necessarily core anymore in the deck. So I would quite like to make those spaces with the Electrode. Something like an extra copy of Budgie could easily come into the deck list. An additional supporter card is always welcome. Even something like a Poke Gear could be okay. And online we have seen the Iron Valiant EX make its way into the deck list to give you that extra reach into the Archludon archetype in particular, whilst possibly also helping out against something like Charizard and Dragapult more generally, where you can weave in these switch cards, get your Valiant pings off, and set them up for KOs later down the line. It's also interesting to see the Pecharunt EX in the deck list as well. This gives you just simply more donk potential with your basic Pecharunt. This has often been taken out of the more modern deck list in favour of higher switch cards, but undoubtedly this does give you higher odds of simply getting your donk with Pech by giving you the opportunity to retreat for the turn into Oranguru, and the Pecharunt EX can then subjugate your own Pecharunt into the active position. There's also the much forgotten third card from Prismatic Evolution, the Black Belt's Training in the deck list, which does allow your Pokemon to do an additional 40 damage. This is just another way that you can wall break through even some chunky stage 2s. So all of the Dragapults in asymmetrical cut fell, but because Aiden was 10-1-1 going into cut, he didn't actually have to play an Asym, so he was the only Dragapult that actually made top 8. And his decklist has some really interesting counts. The 3 Duskull stands out as something you don't commonly see. There's just 1 copy of Budgie, where the debate is between 1 and 2 copies. There's a Rotom V in the decklist, which I've personally been championing. And there's the 2 copies of Lance with no TM evolution in the 60, despite only having 2 copies of Rare Candy in the list. Another standout note is that there is 2 bounces to Stadiums in the deck. Stadium bounces are really important in Dragapult just naturally because we fear the jamming tower from our opponents, but Temple of Sinnoh is a way that you can remove some mist energy and possibly even legacy energy against Lugia, with the Lost Vacuum being that flexible inclusion that can be annoying for mirror match situations and of course Gardevoir as well. At the same time, it can undo the Bravery Charm hit point buff that the likes of Miraidon players will do to undo your Curse Blast combo turn. Typically a Dragapult can have a 2-attack win condition against these aggressive decks like Miraidon. By punching Iron Hands, sprinkling 6 onto Squawkabilly, you play around their switch cart, and now with Lost Vacuum in the decklist as well, you even play around Bravery Charm. So on the following turn, if you can Curse Blast that Squawkabilly whilst gusting the Iron Hands, you've often taken a 6-prize turn, provided you can Painful Spoon onto some 220 hit point Pokemon, or if there's something like a Raikou or Luminion or something else that's easy to KO on the bench. Some counts that I'm currently debating in the 60 are that TM Evolution, which I still think is such a powerful play for this deck. In terms of counts that are in question right now, I think the 4th Drakloak isn't always guaranteed in the list. I think the 3rd Duskull is also a high count, and possibly that Temple of Sinnoh may be more flexible now that there's so much Miraidon. Many players might be put off Lugia going into the EUIC, and I would love to turn this into something like a TM Evolution, an extra Lance, an extra Candy, even something like Artisan in the list. I'm still yearning for extra consistency spaces within this list. But overall, it looks like Dragapult is currently 1-upping Gardevoir as the best stage 2 in the game, and in my testing so far, Dragapult Dusknoir has been quite favoured into the Gardevoir matchup. Let me know what you thought about that matchup down below, because I do think it's a really important one to figure out before the EUIC as to which stage 2 you're going to back. Speaking of which, we're going to end on Michael Davidson's Gardevoir list. It's a really intriguing 60, where you don't see the Drifloon plus Bravery Charm combination that we've become accustomed to, and the frequent debate of Secret Box versus the Unfair Stamp is completely foregone, where now we have the Hero's Cape Ace spec in the list instead. Hero's Cape allows you to be extremely tanky with your Gardevoir EX, and also allows you to put Pheasantipity EX down in mirror match situations, where oftentimes it's going to be a war of attrition, taking out opponents' Curliers and limiting their draw power. The Pheasantipity EX really puts that back in your favour, as long as it's not going to give up those easy prize cards for the opponent. I'm really interested in the 3 TM Evolution 3 Arven counts. I thought logically 4 Arven would just be best. I think the logic is because you play 4 Iono anyway, you naturally see that a little bit more just by using your Iono, but I think it's kind of flawed logic in that just seeing an Arven is usually better anyway. because TM Evolution isn't ideal on its own. It has to come with a Buddy Buddy Poffin a lot of the time regardless. There's also a really interesting suite of basic psychic Pokemon. 3 copies of Munkidori, that's clearly respecting Mirror Matches and Dragapult. Cresselia's in the deck list to kind of do a similar thing. Mimikyu's in here to be an annoying walling Pokemon with Safeguard, and I suppose because you have Hero's Cape, it can naturally be a win condition in some decks anyway. There's Tempting Trap Mawile in the deck. I think a lot of people consider this alongside Budew as like an either-or card, possibly also debating it between Manaphy or not. This card, of course, does give you rug pulls in a lot of situations, with oftentimes Dragapult and Miraidon players only playing 1 switching card in their decks. There's a Spiritomb in the deck list to block Rotom and Luminion from a number of other setup builds, and of course helps out against Lugia. And there's a Pheasantipity EX in the deck list, rather than having something like a Tatsugiri or a Radiant Greninja, to give you that little bit of extra draw power on top of your refinements. Beyond a pretty kooky tool lineup, the item lineup is pretty simplistic. Now let's talk about some of the cards that aren't in the list. Firstly, no Budew. Maybe again, this is because they're expecting Mirror Matches and Dragapult, both of which can punish the low hit points, but I still think this is a really massive card for the Miraidon matchup. Gardevoir can take advantage of Budew so often in the mid game against this deck. You can set up 10 damage off so easily with Adrenabrain and Gardevoir attacks, which is something you're often going to have to do in response to an Iron Hands. So having a mid-game Budew play can stop the opponent from Ultra Balling into Magneton, or just simply using Generator to make their next Iron Hands. I think mid-game Budew is absolutely cracked against Miraidon, and something I've done a lot in my playtesting. Of course, there's also no Manaphy in the decklist either. It's weird to think that Gouging Fire might be one of the main reasons why you should have it in the list these days, but it's equally decent in the mirror to help protect Curlies a little bit. I suppose the logic around this 60 is that you use Pheasantipity anyway and sort of bait the opponent to take out your Curliers. But there is still the looming presence of potential Ceruledge, and still Lugia, of course, does have the option to use that Wellspring Ogerpon, so there can still be a reason to have Manaphy within your list. Of course, we know Henry Chow even played an Irida in the 60 as well, for both the Manaphy and the Greninja being options in his deck. The other thing to note is that there's no Klefki or Fluttermane in the list. Fluttermane, just another decent mirror match card when you can be Adrenabraining and taking prizes and setting up damage across the opponent's board, and Klefki being that real shutdown against these aggressive decks. There's no doubt in my mind that Klefki usage is going to increase, now that we've seen so much domination of Miraidon in this tournament. Miraidon players, it may even be worth going first into Gardevoir these days, just to safeguard yourself from an early Klefki lock. And then the big one is Bravery Charm Drifloon. It can be this ridiculous finisher in a lot of situations, and I think that's probably the best way to utilize the Drifloon these days, because of just how many decks are going to be playing that Jamming Tower or Lost Vacuum to punish a mid-game use of Drifloon. But because of these tech inclusions, and because both Gardevoir and Dragapult can punish this damaged Drifloon so heavily, you can see why players have opted to go in a different direction with Gardevoir into the new Prismatic Evolutions format. So there we go, those are my takes on Mérida. Next weekend is the Puerto Rico SPE, and then we're heading into the EUIC, so hopefully you guys are testing away, making your tweaks to decks. If you were on Miraidon, where's your head at? Personally, I was really excited to play it for the EUIC, but now it seems to be very much on the radar, and techs will be coming in to deal with this matchup. Was Gardevoir overhyped compared to Dragapult? And where does Lugia stand in all this? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in another video tomorrow. Cheers.